good afternoon, everybody. Welcome and thank you for joining us today for our next CxObytes. We're really fortunate today to have JB with us from Chorus. We're going to talk to him in a moment. Welcome, JB. We're doing this each week. We're up to our fifth one, I think, where we're talking to a leader about leadership, and particularly around these disruptive and different times. I mean, we're in level 3 now, but most of us are working from home. So we're going to ask some general questions. Now, just before we get started, people who are now in, remember there is a chat function. Please keep that seamlessly as we go through, because we are recording this. And also a Q&A button at the bottom as well, if you want to type in some questions. And we will take questions as we go. I have some for JB, but if you've got other ones, please chuck them in there and we'll ask JB as we go. So welcome, JB.
Yeah, thanks very much for organizing this, Greg, and hello, everybody. I hope you're all safe in your respective bubbles.
So we've started each week at the moment, because we started this after we got locked down, about you're obviously working at home. So what's your home setup like? What have you done to make sure you can work at home?
Well, I mean, it's interesting because, in fact, a lot of people, when I'm on those video conferences, ask me if I'm at work because of the background behind me. And that was one of the first things I did when we moved into level 4. The day before, I went to the office and looked for a background that I could put into my home office. I was hoping for something a bit smaller. The thing that's behind me is about 2 meters by 3 meters, something we use in conferences. And so it uses half of my home office. But I thought it was important because I knew there'd be many occasions where I'd be on videos. I also had to do some media with TV interviews and things like this. And so that was one of the first things I said was I wanted to make sure that they'd be that brand and that people would be able to recognize the brand whenever I was talking. So that's the big clue behind me was the Chorus logo. So that was one of the first things I did. I'm privileged enough that I'm in a home with not too many people. I don't have young kids. So I haven't had to kind of create that little isolation bubble to be able to do video conferences. I share the office with my wife, and so far we've been able to do it quite well.
Oh, I'm fortunate we've got a big enough house that my wife and I have separate offices. So we haven't had to learn the whole thing about working together, thankfully. I was just thinking, you talked about doing video for media, etc. Don't you think it's been interesting watching the news? They've been able to actually get a lot more video interaction with people because people are now using video in their house.
No, that's very true, and it's funny because I did 2 interviews for, I think it was the AM shows, and one was just before we went into level 4 restriction, but they were still doing restrictions, so they didn't let me into the studio, but they wanted us to come outside the studio and then interview me from there. And the following one was, over a Zoom conference call, and that has become the norm now. So.
That's amazing. Hey, look, we're going to talk about leadership for the next 20 minutes. So can you give us a little bit of your backstory? Because I didn't really introduce you. I mean, you've had senior roles at Telstra over the ditch and at NBN. And please don't ask me my view on what the NBN is compared to what we've done in New Zealand, because I'm pretty much on record on saying ours is much better. You've been a CEO at a startup as well. You're born in France, so you're French. So maybe tell us a little bit about how you got from one side of the world to the other and the journey on the way.
Yeah, I'm very happy to do so. So I'm an engineer by trade. So I studied as a civil engineer. I then went and did an MBA in the US at MIT. So a very quantitative type of management approach. The move to Australia came about 25 years ago, purely out of luck. My wife is American. We were looking at the next place to live. Somebody suggested Australia, and back then we were young, carefree, without kids, and so we thought, let's give it a shot. And that was 25 years ago. I'm now an Australian citizen. My kids consider themselves first Australian, second French, probably third American through my wife. So it's a mixed background. From a leadership perspective, as you said, I've had small business and short job experience at the beginning of my career. And then I started working with Telstra, and then there I discovered the benefit of staying in a big organization for a long time and building tenure and relationships, etc. So that's when I got into senior leadership roles within Telstra. Then, as you said, NBN, and then this gig of Chorus since November is my first as a CEO of a large company, a listed company. It's a top 50 listed here in NZ and even in the top 100 in Australia. So it's it's a very interesting opportunity. I agree with you that this is a much better setup than the NBN setup in Australia. That was one of the big appeals for me taking the job. But from a leadership perspective and going into managing the situation we're in, I've always believed that as a senior leader and especially as a CEO, your number one gig is to create a team and put together a team that can actually run the business. It's one of the big learning when you move into leadership is stop doing things yourself and see yourself as somebody whose number one accountability is to create a team that can actually get the thing done. And in crises like the one we're currently in, that's when it comes to the test. Because your temptation, if you're in a leadership position, is because you've had the comfort to take action and do things. And your natural tendency will be, okay, there's a crisis. Let me go and manage the crisis. And my biggest advice in this situation is make sure you resist the temptation. And that's when you'll see whether indeed you have created a team that's capable of managing the business. Because if you can, that means your team was the right team.
That's a really good point. This question isn't written down, but let's stretch that out a little bit further. As you get further up in an organization, particularly a large one, and become the CEO, you are an engineer. Can you think back to perhaps when you stopped being an engineer and became a leader? What was the most important thing you learned at that point about letting go of being an engineer?
I think that's the hardest thing and the biggest moment where you shift from managing things to leading things and understanding that yes, you have the knowledge, you probably have more experience, so you feel that you could do it better, but realizing that you trying to do everything versus you getting things done through a team and just creating a momentum and inspiring a vision is a much more efficient way to deliver the outcome. Yeah. That's, I think, the moment where you realize, okay, I'm in a different gig than I used to be.
Yeah, and I come back to that comment you made about bringing a team around you. You've got to realize they're the experts, aren't they? Actually, can we just ask you a little bit, just to quickly reflect on jumping from being an exec with a responsibility for a functional area to being the CEO? What's the biggest jump in those two things?
The biggest jump, I think, is that the CEO is a very lonely job. Even when you're in the exec team, you have a number of colleagues that you can go and have a chat with, and they are your equals, and you can have a free-flowing conversation with them. Maybe not with all of them, but there are some that you build a strong relationship with. When you become the CEO, you've got to be careful that because of the role you're in, when you have those conversations with the people who work with you, so the members of the exec team, they're still talking to their boss. And so it changes the content of the conversation. So one of the things I've done around this has now built a network of other CEOs that I talk to, and especially in moments of crisis like this, where you need to be able to bounce ideas with other people. So that's the biggest difference. I think you suddenly realize it's a lonely job because you don't have peers anymore. And so you need to build a new network of peers when you get into that role.
Yeah, actually, can we just tease that out a little bit? I mean, I haven't even moved off the first question yet, but tease it out a little bit further. So you've got this network of other CEOs that you talk to. Do you think there's value in people who are at the beginning of their career having a peer network that isn't their work colleagues, for example?
Absolutely. I think having breadth of exposure in terms of different industries, different companies, even if it's in the same sector, is something really rich. Early in my career, I typically did 2 years and then changed job. And that gave me an exposure to different companies, different leadership styles, different environments. And I think that's something that I'd encourage everybody to do. Now, you might do it like I did by changing gig every 2 years, or you might do it, as you say, by having a network of people that you talk to and develop relationship with so that you understand without having to change job.
I was just thinking that's a great advert for people belonging to organisations like Flint, where you get to network with people and meet people in different organisations. But we'll come back to that later. Look, just moving on, through your leadership journey, everyone loves to ask this question. Through your leadership journey, can you think back to a time where maybe you might have done things differently, where you've made a decision or done something, and now you look back and think, I would have done better if I'd done something much different.
Absolutely, and I think, you know, crises are the time that bring those. I remember one particular crisis when I was at Telstra, where I ended up really managing the situation a lot more than I'm allowed to do it here in the new role. And you know, looking back at it, I probably jumped into operating mode and took control of things rather than step back just a little bit to make sure that other people's managed the crisis while I kept a higher perspective on it. And that was, it would have been about 10 years ago when we had a major breach of confidential data on the network. So we had to take the decision to turn off every at bigpond.com email address and at telstra.com email address for 4 days in Australia. So you can imagine the impact it has on personal, you know, residential, but also businesses. That was a major crisis. And as I said, in hindsight now, I wish I had taken the perspective I've taken on this one, which is to let other people manage the crisis and be one step removed to have a better perspective on it.
Yeah, thank you. That's good. That's an interesting one. Remember, people, you can put questions if you've got them for JB in the Q&A session. There's nothing there yet, but if you want to put something in, happy to pass them on. This is a little bit trite, but it's about, one of the things we've been talking about with people is being authentic and being an authentic leader. Can you talk about why that's important, particularly why it's important to you? Well, if it's important to you, but also what it means to you.
No, it's very important to me. Interestingly enough, we have 4 core values within Chorus, and one of them is authentic, because we do want people to be able to bring who they are to the business. And I think a good environment is one that is tolerant and even welcoming of very different backgrounds, very different perspective, and therefore that being able to bring that authentic yourself to the workplace is an important thing. For me, it means that I'm quite open with people. You know, one of the big things in this particular crisis has been communicating to people, because as we work from home, we lose the opportunity to touch base with everybody. So I've done a lot of little videos for the team. And in some of them, I've shared with them how I was dealing with, you know, my family back in France, how I was dealing with the situation here and things like this. So letting people see that, you know, there is a human being who with the same type of concerns and issues than the one that you're feeling is something that I'm quite comfortable to do.
Yeah, maybe we'll test that out a little bit, because you have only been the CEO since November, and then, you know, coming through, we had Christmas, and New Zealand closes down in January, as you all know. I went off to the UK for a month, which was even more interesting. And then, you know, I was sitting in a lounge in Ireland, in Northern Ireland, watching the TV with this thing happening in Wuhan, hoping that I'd get home in time. And you've suddenly gone into this crisis, managing a big organisation, suddenly dispersed. What skills have you found in yourself that are coming to the fore through this process?
I think the one in particular for this one, and given the working from home, has been the communication. I think it's one of the strengths I have. You know, a lot of people feel uncomfortable recording a video. They'd much rather have people asking questions. It's hard to do it in this environment. So being able to just have a regular 2-minute update to people that brings a little bit of personal story, relates to people, etc., has been something that really has paid off. We've done a engagement survey recently of our own team. We do that regularly. We've now done that on a monthly basis to keep track of everybody. And one of the biggest feedback we've gotten from the team was that made them feel a lot more comfortable about what was happening to hear it directly from me.
That's a good point. It's a good point. Hey, look, we've got a really practical question being asked. That it's around what do you see as the biggest risk to bringing staff back into the office too quickly post level 3? This is a big question to us as well, not because we've got a big office, but I'm wondering whether businesses are going to actually bring staff back in slowly.
And listen, it's exactly the question that we are going through right now. You know, the indication that we could go into level 2 as early as 2 weeks from now. I think 11th of May was the date that was potentially put on the table. On the level 2, you still need to do physical separation. So you need to still have 2 meters away from your nearest colleague. For us at the office, it probably would mean that we could only have half of the people in any given day in the office. So how do you do this? It is not easy to implement. How do you do contact tracing? How do you avoid people going from one floor to another? Is not going to be easy. And then on top of that, there are plenty of external factors that will play. People with kids, depending on what the school situation is, will have an ability to return to the office or not. People with elderly parent that they need to look after may also be impacted, etc. So I think what we've decided was to have a very progressive approach, not rush into it. So we're not going to say, hey, if we're in level 2 by the 11th of May, anybody who wants to come back to the office will be able to. We will really planify it. And one of the first things we're doing is we're doing a survey of all our staff, which is also something that we did before we went into level 4. So we're doing one now. Are you ready? Do you want to? Do you have any constraints, etc.? So we'll definitely be very progressive in doing this. One of the things I wrote down when I was getting ready for this is, in this crisis, what becomes number one above everything is the health and safety of your team. And that should beat everything. And so when you think about, let's go back to the office, we're going to want to make sure that we have dotted all the T's and dotted all the I's and crossed all the T's.
You dot I's and
before
T's
we do
that.
Yeah.
Yeah. I've got a really interesting question that I wanted to ask you that I've been thinking about over the last couple of weeks. Winston Churchill, I've quoted this quite a lot of times with journalists, etc. Winston Churchill said, never let a good crisis go to waste. And, we've seen a huge change in the way we work. We've seen a huge uptake in video conferencing. There are plumbers and architects and builders who are now getting decent connectivity because they're doing things online. Do you think we're going to go back to normal, or do you think there's going to be a new way of how we do things?
This is a great question, and listen, I think one of the things that this crisis has shown is that the investment that New Zealand have done in terms of fiber rollout just paid out massively over the last 4 weeks. I think what the forced level 4 and now level 3 has done is it's kind of accelerated and forced people to do things that potentially could have taken another 12 months or 2 years before they would have felt comfortable with. So the big question will be, will people just snap back to the old way to do it? Or on the contrary, will people go and say, hey, I've now proven that I can be very productive working from home, so I want more flexibility. How about I do 2 days a week working from home and things like this? So again, when you look at a crisis like this, in the short term, what you want to make sure is you do all the right things. So you do the right thing by your team. You also do the right thing by your customers, the community. Now is not the time to kind of try to get an extra dollar out of every connection. On the contrary, you let go because you want to do the right thing. But then you need to start thinking about the longer term future and the post-crisis environment. And for us, either from the way we work ourselves, we'll definitely look at more flexibility around working from home. But we also think that a lot of the businesses that we deal with will do the same, and that will have a longer term impact.
Yeah, that has an impact for us as well. You've obviously got connections to family in France. Could you answer quickly, are we better off than
Oh, yes.
France?
Listen, there are very few places that are getting out of this better than New Zealand. And I know Australia quite well because I still have a lot of friends there. France is in a much more difficult situation, and it will be a lot harder for them to get out. The luck that you have when you're an island, whether you're Australia or New Zealand, is closing your borders is something that is easier to do than when you are France or Spain or Germany. So I think those countries will have a much harder route out of it than we do.
And is the French situation around being able to connect and broadband and work at home, are they able to do that, or we're trying to figure out whether we, in the way we've got our USB, are we that far ahead of everybody?
Listen, at the end of the day, when you think about what you need to be able to work in an isolation format, you need to be able to do video conferencing. It comes down to this. And interestingly enough, you look at our network, when people are all doing video conferencing, it's still less than the peak hour time consumption, which typically happens at night when people download movies and stream movies. So there hasn't been many developed economies where the network itself has been a big limitation as to what people could do in isolation. Even in Australia, I will already acknowledge that the New Zealand model is a lot better than the Australian one. The NBN infrastructure has delivered, and people have been able to work from home. So it's more specific areas. So there have been some people that are on fixed wireless. And in that cell, that fixed wireless might have become congested, so that you've got limited patches like this. But overall, I think networks around the world have done quite well.
Hey, there's a really good question I want to come back to, which is more personal, and we'll just finish off with a couple of personal type things. This person asked, is it possible for a leader to have a moment of fear or strong uncertainty, particularly at these times?
Yeah, absolutely. And when you've got a responsibility for thousands of people, Chorus is about 1,000 people. When you've got a responsibility to shareholders, the market cap of the company is a big one, so there is a lot of money invested in this company. You do have moments of big uncertainties. I've been very privileged that in this particular crisis, we're not one of the businesses that is facing massive reduction in activity. We're not Air New Zealand, we're not a tourism business. In fact, right now people need and use our services more than they've ever before. Our customers are not retailers, they are the big telcos. So absolutely, there've been a couple of nights where I've had a hard time falling asleep, trying to make sure that we're doing the right things. That's fine. That's why you need a strong team, so that you can validate the decisions that you make. And then when you communicate to your team, then you need to be quite comfortable in having made that decision and not projecting somebody who's full of doubt and not knowing what he's doing.
Okay, look, I'm going to ask you a quick question, and then we'll come back to the last one. There's one in here about and can I ask you to be brief on this one? Yeah. How does Chorus see themselves in the 5G future?
I'll try to be brief. For me, 5G is a complementary technology then to fiber, so it's not something that will come and completely replace fiber. I believe it will allow people to do a lot more when they're on the road. I think there'll be a small segment of the market that will decide that it's a proper technology for their home connection. I still believe that the majority of people, especially having gone through isolation, will realize that the best connectivity they can have is a fiber in their home.
Okay, so now we'll flick back to personal. Sorry, I wanted to make sure I didn't get asked afterwards, why didn't I ask you that question? So it comes back to that thing about fear and uncertainty. We've been locked down for 5 weeks. We're still at home. You've been physically isolated as well. Just have you got any advice or to our participants about maybe what you've learnt about yourself in this time, or what you think you'd be able to share with people about how can they remain focused and keep themselves healthy from your own personal experience?
And as for me, it's been interesting because of the work that we do and the fact that in fact there is even more pressure on our business. I've never had days where I woke up not knowing what I was going to do. I've been in the office from 7:30 in the morning to typically 7 at night, just doing those things because we've had to make sure that everything was going to continue to work and working with the rest of the industry. So I know a lot of people would have had problems because the volume of activity they were doing was lowering. I didn't have to face this. I would say the biggest learning for me, especially in this working from home environment, is because you miss all the cues that you get on a day-to-day basis by being in the office. People will send you email, talk to you, etc. But just walking down the corridor, seeing how people are behaving, seeing the mood around the cafeteria at lunchtime, etc., is a very important cue for everybody in the business, and in particular for somebody in my position. Not having that has been a big challenge. And so the way I've kind of tried to get my daily cues has been whenever I've had those video conferences to make sure that there's 5 minutes where we just talk about, the world, how things are coping. We joke about the fact that there's a cat that moves in the background, etc. Just to try to get a cue for how people are actually dealing with the situation.
Cool. Hey, thank you so much, JB, for your time. Just to remind people that next week we've got CxObytes again at 11 a.m. on Friday. We're talking with Lillian Grace. Lillian is the founder and CEO of Figured Group, so quite a different perspective. She's been working remotely since she created Figured Group 8 years ago, so we can have a chat to her about the things she's learned through there. But thank you once again, JB, for being with us today, and hope you have a great rest of the day, and hopefully you get to take the weekend off.
Yeah, no, thanks for that. I hope so too. Thanks for organizing this. Hopefully this has been useful, and look forward to continuing to work with you and the rest of your crew.
Thanks very much. All right. See you later,
Cheers.
everybody.